So if this kind of language, this kind of apocalyptic eschatology is in the New Testament, both explicitly and implicitly, of course the big challenge for us is how do we make sense of it? How do we interpret it? And we're faced with a big challenge. And that challenge is that writing comes in different kinds. The technical term for that is genre, which is simply the French word that means kind of writing. And for every kind of writing, there are assumptions made about how you'd write that in that way, and therefore also how you would read that kind of writing. Now that sounds very complicated, but it's actually the sort of thing we do every day. You know, if a letter falls on your through the letterbox on the floor, and you pick it up and it sort of says, "Dear Sir," and it's all left aligned and has your address on one side and the sender's address on the other, then you know what kind of writing this is. It's a letter from a bank manager kind of writing. And without realising, constantly our minds are switching into seeing what kind of writing this is. And as we read it, we interpret it appropriately. If you have a letter from a bank manager, you tend to read it in a literal way. If he says you are overdrawn and you're going to pay a penalty, you take that seriously. If you have a different kind of letter and it starts off, "My dear darling Ian," then I'm going to read it in a different kind of way. It's a different kind of writing. But of course, understanding correctly those kinds of writings assumes some familiarity with the conventions involved. And when we come to look at apocalyptic writing, the problem we've got is that we don't understand, we're not familiar with the conventions. These are things that kind of pop up out of the blue and we're unfamiliar with them. And what we forget is actually in Jesus' day, in the first century, people were very, very familiar with it. We've got huge tomes of apocalyptic writing. It was a way of talking, a way of speaking, a way of thinking that people were very familiar with. They understood the conventions and they knew how to interpret in a way that we don't. And what that means is that there's a sense in which there's a vacuum of understanding for us. And of course, vacuums suck things in. And with apocalyptic language, that vacuum of understanding in the modern day has sucked in all sorts of spurious ways of interpreting and ways of using that language. Now, people often talk about apocalyptic language as being very visual or having a lot of images in. And I can understand why it's tempting to talk in those terms. We have horsemen galloping, we have suns and going dark and moons turning red as blood and stars. It feels very visual. But strictly speaking, it isn't visual language. It's not about images, because those are things that belong outside of text. Within a text, if you're describing something in a visual way, what you're actually doing is using metaphors. Apocalyptic is a metaphorical, particularly metaphorical way of speaking. And again, that gives us another whole set of problems because following the Enlightenment, in our very modern scientific age, we live in a world where we tend to think of, as it were, real language, valuable language, the hard currency of language, as stuff which is literal, which is scientific. And we separate that off from language which is contains these kind of images, from metaphorical or poetic language. We live in a world which tends to place a very high value on the literal and scientific and a very low value on the metaphorical or the poetic, or perhaps not quite value, but usefulness, reality. You know, the stuff of science is hard and it's testable and it's tangible and you can touch it. The stuff of poetry might evoke our feelings, but it's much less to do with facts. Now, that has a problem for religious language generally, because all our language about God has to be metaphorical. We can't test God, we can't touch in that kind of scientific way. But it also offers us a particular challenge when we're looking at apocalyptic language, because it is of such a metaphorical nature. But it's inevitable that we use metaphors to describe that which we don't understand, that which we can't describe in the language that we've already got. And in fact, you actually find this even in science, is that when there's a new area of knowledge that opens up, inevitably the language becomes metaphorical. When this whole new world of the internet started, what did people do? Well, they coined words from other areas and applied them metaphorically to the internet. So we surf the internet, which shows its origins in California perhaps. We visit sites. Well, of course, we're actually literally doing no such thing. We're downloading information from one computer to another. But in a new area of experience, a new area of knowledge, then the way we expand our language is by coining these kinds of metaphors. And of course, in a grand scale, that's what theology is doing. It's trying to describe the indescribable. And there's a sense in which apocalyptic is doing that par excellence. How do we envisage, how do we talk about the end of things as we know them? How do we talk about the transformation by God of the very fabric of the universe? And the only way we can do that is by extending our language using these very powerful, these very vivid metaphors. Now, the way that metaphor works gives us a particular challenge. In the past, New Testament scholars have said, look, this kind of apocalyptic way of viewing the world, we simply don't believe the same things anymore. We live in a scientific age. We need to, as it were, translate those metaphors into a different kind of language. The problem is that when you do that, you actually lose the meaning of the metaphor. When a metaphor is coined, what happens is the person coining the metaphor takes particulars, real things in that person's world, and by using the metaphor, describes them in a way that then actually transcends the particulars. It doesn't take them away from the historical context. If we try and translate the metaphor into other kinds of, if we try to demythologize it, we actually start to lose the specific content of what the metaphor is talking about. But metaphor's power is precisely that. While it's still rooted in a particular context, in a particular historical situation, it actually is able to transcend that. So, for instance, in the book of Revelation, we see the Roman Empire being described as a beast that tramples the saints. Now, that's a very, very powerful image, and we need to remember where it comes from to understand some of the dynamics of how that works. And yet, of course, the way that that image is deployed makes it very accessible. So, over the centuries, Christians in different times, in different places, who've been the subject of oppressive regimes, see themselves and their situation in that metaphor. Somehow or other, by, as it were, shearing off the historical details, the metaphor begins to transcend its context and apply into other contexts. But it only has its power, it only has its content by recognizing the historical situation that it comes from. So as we look at the metaphors in the New Testament, particularly as we look at the metaphors of apocalyptic way of describing the end, apocalyptic eschatology, we have to recognise both the historical situation, the historical rootedness of those images on the one hand, but also how those images, those metaphors transcend their particular historical situation and can apply elsewhere. Now that means that in particular, that the specific language about Jesus' return, about the end, seeing those as metaphorical doesn't take away from the expectation of an historical reality. And of course what that means is in different parts of the New Testament we find different kinds of metaphors describing different aspects of the significance of Jesus' return. Very often they don't fit together very neatly. And attempts to fit them all together, bits from Matthew's Gospel, bits from 1 Thessalonians perhaps, bits from the book of Revelation, the language of the millennium, when we try to put them together, what we're actually doing is putting together a jigsaw which doesn't fit. The bits, the different aspects of those, the different metaphors are saying different kinds of things. They do have a coherence and they make sense when you read them in historical context. But what you can't do is trim them and cut them and fit them all together. And if you try to do that, what you end up doing is distorting each individual piece. And if you look carefully at the texts themselves, you see that the way these are put together as a jigsaw very often fails to pay attention to what the texts themselves actually say. And then you're on a hiding to nothing.